So hello to you all and a warm welcome to what I'm hoping is going to be a fabulously informative discussion today on the impact of pandemic on workplace inclusion. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. My name's Dawn Jackson and I am co-chair of the Inclusion and Belonging Committee at the City Women Network, otherwise known as CWN. So we welcome both members and non-member guests today, and a big thank you for the donations you have made to our charity Wellbeing of Women. So CWN is also delighted to be hosting this event along with one of our corporate members, Namura. Oliver Tucker, Managing Director of UK Investment Banking, joins us. And so I'm just going to hand over to you now, Oliver, to say a few words.
Sure, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great, yeah. Well, thank you for that intro, Dawn. Yep, as well as being in the investment banking division, I'm also co-head of our WIN Gender Balance Network here in Europe. This event actually kicks off a week's worth of events that we are running to mark National Inclusion Week. And this topic is one which is very much at the forefront of our minds during these unprecedented times. As a network, but also more broadly in Namura, we are wrestling with how to cope with COVID pandemic. Plus we're in the middle of relaunching our D&I strategy, including recently launching our Embrace network. So I really look forward to hearing the panel's views. And just before I hand over, just a quick thank you to CWN who have helped put together this fantastic event, and to say that we continue to really value our partnership with you. So with that, I hand it over to Sasha and the panel.
Actually, I'll just say one or two more words before I hand to Sasha, because I was keen to just introduce the panel. Thanks so much, Oliver, and really am enjoying working with Namura. I've been doing so for the past few months. We had a bit of a false start with COVID earlier this year, didn't we, when we had to stop an event? Yeah, good to go today, so really exciting. So I wanted just to introduce the panel. We have a fantastic range of experience and thinking on this virtual table today. So I'm going to try and do them a service. Obviously it's going to be a summary, but let's see. So Christine Hemphill is the first panelist. So she's founder and managing director of Open Inclusion. It's a London-based inclusive insight design and innovation consultancy, and she focuses in particular on inclusion from the perspective of developing environments that are simply accessible to all. We then have Casey Goundiam, and she's joining us all the way from Canada today. So Casey is the founder and CEO of Red Dot Digital, and she brings her forward-thinking, data-driven approach to the world of digital strategy and management consulting. And what is more, she's based in Canada, obviously, and Casey's on the working group that advises Ontario, I don't know how you pronounce it, and federal ministers on the economic relaunch in the context of COVID-19. We also have Sanjeev Sharma. He joins us from M&G Real Estate, where he's Chief Property Officer. Sanjeev has an active involvement in D&I, particularly around issues concerning culture and race, going back to his previous role as head of HR at NatWest Life. He's been involved in the Business and the Community Initiative Race for Opportunity, which focuses on improving and advancing BAME within UK PLC. And he's now on the management committee of Real Estate Balance, an organisation of senior real estate professionals seeking to address gender imbalance. Our wonderful panelists will be ably supported and facilitated by Sasha Scott. And Sasha is the founder and CEO of the Inclusive Group, and is an expert in diversity, bias, inclusivity, and managing psychological health. She particularly understands the commercial drivers behind reducing bias within the workplace, and the critical need to promote and sustain inclusive workplaces to attract and retain the best talent. So as you can see, we have a wealth of talent around the table, and I personally am really looking forward to learning more from them. But before I hand over to Sasha, just a quick point about Q&A. So we've disabled the chat function today. So if you have questions, please feel free to post them under the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. They can be posted anonymously if you need that as well. And we're hoping to do 15 minutes Q&A at the end of the session. So all it leaves me to do now is to hand over to you, Sasha.
Dawn, thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fantastic to be part of this panel and be there in a moderating capacity. It's also really great to see some familiar faces around our virtual table and to welcome new faces as well. It's amazing that we have got 67 people online. I am sure that everybody is relatively time poor, so we need to get on with the business of what we're talking about. And I have to say that discussing the impact of the pandemic on workplace inclusion is a massively, massively important topic from an I&D perspective. And we really welcome your questions. So please, don't hold forth in coming back with our questions on this. But we've got an amazing panel because the panel breadth is really enormous in terms of the experience that Christine, Casey and Sanjeev bring to the table. So I'm going to get straight in and I'm going to first of all go to Christine, who, as I'm looking at on Zoom, is on my right hand side. And Christine, obviously you have a particular lens on this in terms of accessibility. And I'd like to ask you the question of how employee needs and expectations have and are continuing to change as a result of the pandemic. So I'm going to repeat that question because there's a lot going on it, and I'm going to have to be quite tight on time with everybody. But Christine, how do you believe employee needs and their expectations have and are continuing to change as a result of this volatile pandemic that we're all in?
Thank you, Sasha. That's a fabulous question. Yes, as you say, plenty in there. I think, again, just coming from the perspective that I tend to put over this, which is how do people's personal contexts and abilities match or mismatch the environment they're in to be more or less effective in the workplace? So, just to put in perspective of the way I really think about it. And the changing workplace has obviously meant that that mismatch can happen in many different ways and many different places. So now a very high proportion of people are working from home. That means that there is the digital setup at home and how well that and how effective that is for an individual, and particularly thinking about individuals with specific access needs. So they might have a physical disability, they might be deaf or hard of hearing, be visually impaired and use technologies, or actually just think differently and have the cognitive processes that are different, whether it's memory or learning style or communication style, etc. Now, two things have changed enormously. One is people are working from home, so the environment's changed. Actually, very interestingly, people are not static either, and people have changed. And I think probably the most obvious of these changes is to mental health. I think the layer of stress and challenge that COVID environment has put us all under has meant people have more varying mental health. And certainly the diary study we did early in COVID showed this very fully. Whether or not people had mental health challenges beforehand or not, we're all varying more. And actually that norm level has come down a bit across the community. So starting off, our individuals have changed in the workplace, we've all changed. And then the workplace itself has changed. So the opportunity for a mismatch between an employee and the environment that they need to work in has dramatically moved because of these two layers. The only way we can really solve for this is ask people, how is it working for you? What's challenging? Where are the barriers that are getting in the way of, first and foremost, you being able to, do the core elements of your job? And I really like the jobs to be done kind of framework of what are the key elements for any job that people are trying to do. So that core capability, then in terms of your efficiency, then in terms of the communication and collaboration, and actually very importantly in this environment for all the businesses out there, also in terms of creativity. So at each of those layers, essentially, how is this match or mismatch between person and environment supporting or getting in the way of employees being able to be effective, be collaborative, and be creative in the workplace. So a lot in there. Sorry.
Sure. No, that's really great, and it's really important food for thought, because what I'm taking away from that is if you're on this call and you're in the business of running a business, whether it's an investment bank, whether it's a startup, whether it's technology, I think one of the key things there is treating everybody as individuals, listening and having the conversations, and then applying the need from a technology perspective to individuals, because of course COVID and the pandemic is a storm that each and every one of us, all 69 people on this call, are in, but very different boats from a demography and from a diversity perspective. So thank you, Christine. Okay, I'm going to come to you, Casey. Super exciting that you're coming from Canada. I love it. And having been crawling around on doing my due diligence, massive respect from me in terms of what you do. Casey, I'm going to ask you about that collision of COVID and Black Lives Matters. To what extent has the spotlight on inclusion been accelerated by the pandemic compared to the recent terrible tragedies that have focused the Black Lives Matters movement? So it's a complicated question, but really fascinated in your response.
Thank you, Sasha. So for me, the way I look at inclusion is really that I've thought about it for a very long time, obviously. I actually addressed that question and the question of inclusion in the remote workplace for a while, maybe 5 years ago. So it's not a new, I would say, questioning. I've also been part of global teams in the realm of corporate, where we were already thinking about the future of work. So, remote working was already there. As an entrepreneur, I manage a team of diverse people around the world. So really what I thought was a catalyst for inclusion was Black Lives Matter. That, as you said, the collision between, we were in the middle of a pandemic, and then we had Black Lives Matter movement at the same time, where you literally had to think about gender, skin color, religious differences. And that's, I think, this is what really nudged companies and corporates and startups or any working environment to really think about it in a very different manner. Because all of a sudden, you did have to think about people who were visually and visibly different. And that really took, and there's a surge in North America, for example, there's a surge in inclusion training. People are rethinking what they've been doing for years. They're rethinking the training environment. They're rethinking the diversity and inclusion conversations. And there's a shift that we're seeing where they're actually maybe stopping what they've been doing because it hadn't been working before. And they're rethinking things also in what Christine said, in mental health, in the light of mental health, in how are you, the divide between social classes. If you're set up in a really nice house and you have a great internet access, fantastic, you can work from home. But if you don't even have a computer, how does that work? So I think there's definitely a catalyst, and we shouldn't be looking at inclusion as this remote working space only.
No, I agree. And Casey, we certainly see those accentuating differences between different demographies as the pandemic impacts from a social mobility perspective. Now, I'm in London and I run a diversity consultancy. I've done it for 20 years and the phone just isn't stopping ringing at the moment because I strongly believe we are at a changing point in history. And now's our opportunity to do more and focus on actions, really be focused on actions. Now, I don't want to exclude the lovely Sanjeev. Welcome. Good to see you again, my friend. I'd like to ask you a question. How do you think remote working during COVID has perhaps impacted on ethnicity, people of color, individuals differently to other groups? Really interested in looking at it through that lens. but working virtually, or maybe, as is our new normal from a UK-centric perspective, a blended, I'm in the office, I'm out the office, I don't know what the messages are. Yeah, what does that look like from that lens?
I think firstly, the point you raised, Sasha, about the fact we're all individuals. So in my sort of response, and I'll use the term BAME, it's not always helpful putting everyone into a neat little sort of box, if you like. But for our sort of purposes, I'll just sort of do that. And because we're individuals, intersectionality, all our circumstances, all of those sort of things mean you can't have a one-size-fits-all answer. But just specifically from an ethnicity sort of perspective, there's probably a few things I've sort of noticed. So I think if you're from a BAME background, people are used to both indirect and direct discrimination, if you like. But I think working away from the office and working from home, which, as you said, is the new norm, I think there's a risk of what we sort of term distance bias. So this is being out of sight and out of mind. So how does one stay visible, if you like, to reach one's career goals if you're not in the office, if you like? And in the UK, certainly, I've not been back in the office for over 6 months, which is probably the same for most of my colleagues. So I think distance bias and working away from the office has the potential for a disproportionate effect on certain groups, particularly BAMEs. I think if you're from a BAME group, you already probably feel marginalised. And as Casey sort of said, you know, Black Lives Matter put a spotlight on that. So, you know, if you like, you don't have a seat at the table. Now, do you have a voice in virtual meetings, as an example? So I think it's about how do you ensure you have that inclusivity and you don't have this out of sight. Now, people talk about working from home being a great leveler, if you like, and they said the same thing about COVID-19. It didn't discriminate. Well, we clearly know it does. You know, there's loads of health inequalities. If you're from a BAME background, you're 2 or 3 times more likely to die of COVID. And that was a Public Health England analysis. Similarly, I think one of the things we've noticed in our organisation, if you're from a particular cultural background, and for example, women in certain cultural backgrounds, there's an expectation they pick up a lot of the burden in the home as well. So when the kids were at home as well, so you're doing a double shift, if you like. So you're trying to do both working from home and working in the office, and something has to give. And what tends to happen then, it's work. But the other issue around this then I think is around managers, because managers' reference points are very, very different. They're not from the same background, culture, family expectations are different. But how do they make sure they understand what their staff are going through and how they can make sure, and there's a wonderful expression I sort of picked up, which is how do managers sort of check in on their staff rather than checking on them? And there's a big difference there. And I think a lot of managers don't get the difference between those two things. So I think particularly if you're from a different cultural background, ethnicity, it's trying to understand and have those informal conversations, trying to understand why individuals are going through what they're going through working from home.
Sanjeev, thank you very much. And I think that that plays very well into the leadership responsibility to be very cognizant of the biases we have and allyship and how you platform people on Zoom and how easy it is to be ignored in that. I'm going to go back in the interest of inclusion to Christine. And Christine, having heard what Sanjeev has said and what Casey has said, with your lens of accessibility and technology, just very interested in your perspective in sort of moving this forward.
It's a really, you know, it is, you know, and Sanjeev was talking about intersectionality. Everyone is on a spectrum of ability. So we, you know, when it comes to ability, it's an interesting one because 100% of us have changing abilities, whether it's because we're tired, stressed, have a long-term health condition, etc. But some people, they're so significantly different that either it's an interesting split again is hidden versus visible difference. And this is particularly important in terms of how an organisation can support staff, because when we're talking about Black Lives Matter or other more visible differences, gender, not so much sexual preference, but certainly gender, it's more visible. Whereas disability, actually the majority of disability is invisible, not visible. And the majority of employees choose not to disclose at work that they have an access need rather than disclose, because that balance and the trade-off between risk and potential benefit of sharing their access needs in at work, that the majority of people tend to trade off that they prefer to hold that to themselves. So creating safe spaces for hidden differences to be understood better, and therefore to solve for it, whether it's with technology, with processes, with management approaches, with that line manager, which Sanjeev was talking about, is an absolutely critical role in terms of enabling all people in a team. And creating a culture and tools and processes that work for that in that group, as opposed to trying to create it for a whole organisation. So I think there's some really interesting differences between our differences that need to be understood in order to address them. And then whether we use technology to do that, and recognising we're moving to new technology. So things like this, a Zoom session, understanding how do we create that so that it works really well for people who have hearing loss, for example, having captioning available, or people who have sight loss, who it might be difficult if things are being shared. So how do you do that beforehand so people get access? So just thinking through, I tend to try and flip it and say, who may be excluded? And don't ask who is excluded, because some people will wish not to share, but who may be excluded. Design in for that exclusion so that you can reduce and minimize that using whatever tools, processes, management style at your disposal, so that you have the greatest enablement of your workforce that's possible.
Okay, I love that as a takeaway from in our mind, who might be excluded, but without making the assumption. Okay, Casey, back in the room. Casey, I want to ask you, along that trajectory, from your opinion, to what extent has the increasing reliance on digital communication and remote working impacted on that bias point and inclusivity? So I'm going to repeat the question: to what extent has the increased reliance on digital communication, this world we're in, and remote working impacted on bias and feelings of inclusivity?
Right, that's again a really brilliant question, and another one that I've seen for years. So inclusion obviously is something that we talk about for years, and I love that Christine is bringing this disability lens to the conversation. And digital communication, I feel, based on my experience and what I've seen both in corporate and in the startup environment, reduces bias and increases feeling of inclusion in the workforce. Okay. And I've looked at it from the lens of unified communication and collaboration tools, so what we call UCC, where people can actually work from home. They can connect across different, I think they connect across differences differently. When you are in a Zoom meeting, where you are on a WebEx or whatever the tool is, you can switch off your video. You can rely solely on voice. But I think it also the stress of face-to-face interaction actually is diminished. And also you provide different cues physically when you're on video than when you're in person. I think we still judge each other. We still are going to have perception. It's still going to happen, but there's somehow a way to reduce that and congregate around common and shared values. That reminds me of a friend of mine who was she was sitting in San Francisco, but she was managing a big global team. And she was telling me how for years she hadn't seen her team face to face. So they did not know that she was LGBT. And she went to visit them in Japan. And all of a sudden, their perception changed. And she was talking about her wife. And that was very, very complicated for them to understand. And I think what happened there is, when you're congregating around tools, when you're texting, when you're emailing, I think there's a way to, and I'm going to step back and say it does take empathy. It does take self-awareness. It does take other skill set that we haven't been necessarily taught. And this is where maybe the complication comes in. And this is where I think leadership has to step in and cannot just let it to middle management to solve. Because we all know that people leave jobs because of their managers, not because of the work. So I think there has to be their training on how to be a new manager as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that's about embedding it in leadership behaviors, that people resign from people, right? But I'm really fascinated by what you're saying here, that in some respect, when we're all together in a room, if I turn my camera off, does that not make the group think Sasha's less included though? I mean, this visual stuff, is it not really important when we're all collaborating on a platform? I don't know. I'm really interested.
In my experience, it has actually been, especially for women and for younger women and for women of color, it has actually worked in our favor. I lead a team of where you have 60% women and 40% men, 12 different countries, very different backgrounds. We are as diverse as you can take it. There's neurodiversity, LGBT diversity, you name it, disability as well. And what I find when we speak with certain clients, the fact that we turn off the video actually works in our favor because they will listen to us.
Yeah, and listening, so underestimated, right?
Exactly.
Okay, I love that. I love that. Sanjeev, when you hear that, what do you think in terms of how do we optimize inclusion through virtual platforms?
I think it's a difficult question to answer because we're all very different. And it's been interesting over the last 6 months in England. I was going to say UK, but we have different governments, devolved approaches, which complicates matters. But in the England, where we're still sort of largely working from home, I've noticed a change over the last 6 months. We've gone through the honeymoon period where people were, I'm working from home. Technology was working. You know, historically, working from home was a few people working 1 or 2 days a week, or it was really around disaster recovery. So if your office building wasn't going to be around, actually, you're going to work from home for a short period. But over 6 months, technology has held up. And what I've noticed is people have gone through this sort of curve, if you like, of loving it in the honeymoon period. And now, actually, as Casey sort of mentioned, particularly around video calls, I am noticing more and more people switching off their videos. Now, that's partly to do, I think, because people are trying to separate work from home. So it's a bit like reality TV, whereas if you're in the office, people know you go home, you've got a different life. Whereas now people look into your living room or your dining room, what's behind them? You know, do they have a bookshelf like Christine? Me, I'm sort of personal. And people object to that now because there is no separation. And I think this also links into the fact that the other thing I think technology, why they are switching off now, is to do with the hours people are now working. So we've moved from the long office hours culture with the jacket on the back of the chair to actually virtually being available 24/7. I think it was Nord who facilitate VPNs, and they did an analysis, and I think they worked out that it's an extra 2 hours a day people are now working from home compared to the office. So for me, you know, in the mornings I used to commute. It took me an hour and a half, commute an hour and a half at the end of the day. So I had these bookends, if you like. Now I picked up emails at the beginning, end of the day, but I knew there was a framework, if you like, whereas now that's gone. So as soon as you get up, you're working, you know, there's no sort of stopping as well. So I think technology, we have to be mindful. It should be an enabler, a tool, but actually it can become a millstone as well.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Yeah, actually, Sanjeev, yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, and you're absolutely right. There is no lack of, you know, it's just one continual flow of Zoom to Zoom to Zoom, and there's no context. We don't arrive in a room, smell a coffee, look out of the window. We're just there. I would actually give you a contrary view that I feel to some extent having cameras and an insight into our world has humanized workplaces, because suddenly you see the chaos behind me, the cats and the dogs killing each other, the random children, and then, you know, the caring responsibilities, but not all the time. You know, there was a fabulous clip, which I imagine everyone may have seen on the call, where it was an interviewer who worked for the BBC coming out of Hong Kong, and into his room, you know, children in those little things, my kids are so old now I've forgotten what they're called, but interesting bit of bias on that story as well, because then followed by the woman who pulled the children out, and the assumption was, oh, there's the Filipino nanny, actually his wife. But it created a more human character. So I've seen leaders really give their pandemic moments, heart on sleeve moment, and that, so instead of being this, you know, investment banker or a partner at a law firm, they suddenly become more human. So, you know, like you say, individuals. Mindful of time, Christine, back to you. Sanjeev has reiterated the critical point that everyone needs to be treated as an individual. So pulses, employee engagement survey, listening to employees. How are businesses gathering the voice of their workplace and insight to basically support ongoing understanding about gaps and addressing problems? What do you see through your design and your technology lens on listening?
Interestingly, in you know, inclusive employee experience has just become a much more important listening post because of all these changes we've all been talking about. And organisations, a lot of them had pulses and employee engagement scores and specific, you know, measures of this in the past. What's really interesting now is having the markers attached to individuals, and not to individual people that can then be personally identified, but in a way that it can then be summarised up to be understood why those employee experiences are really different. So I think the ability for people to self-identify as having, you know, a hidden difference, particularly because, you know, visible, even when you're looking at data, a visible difference isn't visible because you don't know that someone's name is relevant to a difference, but understanding those markers of difference and then looking for how that's impacting that community. And then, because we're all individuals, not a community, even within a community, understanding those kind of sub-community differences, the addressable, designable differences, that to me is the important thing. Enable your organisational designers, be they people procuring technology for the organisation, people going and supporting people with individual adjustments, managers learning how to manage different groups, cultural programs to support reducing bias and increasing enablement of various groups. All of these are design interventions that need to be fueled through insight. And if our insight's coming in without a recognition of which groups people are in or what differences are relevant to the experiences they're getting, and this isn't just personal, it's quite interesting, not just their individual. When we're talking about disability, it may be that they're a carer of a disabled child. I personally have a son who's dyslexic and ADHD, and parenting, you know, a child at homeschooling who's dyslexic and ADHD takes a little more time and effort. Thankfully, I have a husband who is fabulously supportive of him, but this is a difference that is harder to pick up. So just recognizing that difference comes in a range of forms, including some of them that are specific to COVID. Just one thing on what Sanjeev was talking about before. I think that human element of COVID is really important too. And there's been some very interesting positive take-ups of very human conversations. As Sasha, you were saying, the, you know, dogs walking in the background, that wasn't a ghost, that was my dog walking in before. Kids coming in, sounds from outside, recognition of where people are and where they live and what that looks like. Allowing people the time and space in a workplace to have those water cooler moments, to have that "how are you today" conversation, that I think, given the situation we're in, from a health and mental health perspective as a community is even more important now. So yes, we can Zoom all day and get the work done, but make sure that the space to actually understand each other, so people aren't just living in their personal bubbles of their own human environment and experience, but we're constantly building that empathy and building people outside of their own bubble into the broader community of the workplace and the community.
Brilliant, Christine. Thank you very much indeed. I'm most disappointed it was a dog and not a ghost, but hey ho. Casey, back in the room. So Casey, I'm going to ask you a question. Actually, it's not my question. It's been asked by Uma. And Uma, thank you for this amazing question. Casey, I'm going to read it. I don't know if you can see access to the questions, but I'm going to read it out for everybody to hear. How can organizations support their people managers to have, quote, culturally sensitive conversations with the BAME employees, i.e. using appropriate language, asking questions that are culturally appropriate, and the lived experience of BAME employees is incredibly powerful. They have experiences that must need to be heard. How do we help draw these out in an appropriate manner? So there's a lot going on that question. Let's just cut it to how, tips. How can managers have culturally sensitive conversations with their BAME employees?
This question makes me smile. I absolutely love it, because I've literally become the CEO of my network, the CEO of Black people of my network, when it comes to questions around that. And I joke about it because what BLM has done is it has drawn those people who really wanted to understand to ask some very uncomfortable question for them. Black people and BAME, I believe in the UK, that's how you say it. We've heard those questions all the time. So I want to start with, let's go with the assumption, the proven assumption that diversity and inclusion is good for business. We don't have to prove that anymore. We know that those teams are outperforming the others. Now, if you're a manager of of BAME employees, I think openness, I'm in favor of being open, direct. Sometimes you will be awkward and you have to accept that. I think you have to go in with the self-awareness and, voice it that you don't know. And you'd like to be open, and you will sometimes say stuff that are not appropriate, and it's okay. I think BAME and the majority of people I know are not going to be offended because they're going to be asked those questions. They get offended when they get invisible, invalidated, sometimes told that they should not feel that way. That's where we get offended and pissed off. But if you actually ask us why I'm wearing my hair in a certain way, or why culturally I do certain things, I think people are very open to educating, and sometimes they take it very well. So I think you just have to take it in a human way, and you have to maybe position yourself in how would you like people to also address you in specific situations. And that's where, again, I keep repeating it, but it comes with self-awareness and empathy. Let's be more human about things.
Yeah.
And I think this will really, when there's good intention, usually there's no bad blood.
Okay, so assume a positive intent. And interestingly, Casey, thank you for that. Anthony has come on the chat and said, well, what happens when they get it wrong? But you've answered that, because we're human, we're fallible, we will make mistakes. So feel the awkwardness and learn from it. If people have got a growth mindset, if I say something incorrect to you, Casey, and I'm certainly not perfect, I would like to be educated if I've got it wrong, and then I'll learn better for next time. I think what happens with Black Lives Matters, particularly at the moment, is it's increased the fear of the white community to create a paralysis that says, I don't want to say the wrong thing. My default is I'll say nothing. And that takes us nowhere. And I certainly think from a white perspective, which is the only perspective I can talk about it from, we need to do the work as well. We need to do the work. We need to understand things. We need to stop always asking our Black brothers and sisters to explain. But when we get things wrong, please correct us.
Same thing with women. Take it exactly with the same fight as women. It's just called, it's intersectionality. Like we're at a point where we're at the same, we're basically where women were 100 years ago, when we couldn't vote. And this is where BAME people are. Now, how do we make ourselves more visible? And the same work that has been done for gender needs to be done now for the other groups.
Yeah.
That's, you know, and ignoring it is not going to solve the problem.
Okay, great. I'm mindful, thank you of that. I'm mindful of time. It's 1:42 in London, or the UK, England. And I want to get on to some questions here. So here's a great question from Martha. Martha, thank you very much. How can allies adjust their support to suit the new working from home environment? Brilliant question. You know, global allies, we need to have global allies, we need to be global allies, but what does that look like behaviorally online? So I'm going to ask that to Christine to start with, and then Sanjeev, I'd love your opinion.
Thank you, Sasha. A great question. I think the starting point is that back to that, who's being excluded, being really mindful of, if you're in a session, who's there, and making sure the full diversity is coming in. And actually, you know, people that are quieter, people that may be, you know, much more introverted, making sure that their voice is heard, allowing people different formats to engage. So some people might wish to put information in ahead of time and have someone present that for them, in the same way that in a physical workplace, same with virtual workplaces. Give people a range of options to provide their input in the way that best suits them and best enables that, you know, them to be fully engaged. And as a manager or as a team leader or even as a host of a meeting, really be conscious of who has contributed and who might not have had the opportunity yet. And is there anything, also just learning at the end of a session, because we don't go back to that, we always get it wrong. Yeah, we're humans, we're fallible, and we're always learning, and this is a new environment for many. So asking people, how did that go for you? Did you feel you had the opportunity to understand everyone's views and contribute your own effectively? And if there's some way we can do this better, please tell us.
Love it, Christine, thank you. Over to Sanjeev. How can we be allies digitally? Digital allies, we can make that a group.
I'll answer it in a slightly different way. So from an M&G perspective, we've got our sort of networks, if you like. And what we've sort of discovered is there's so much overlap in between those different sort of aspects of D&I, if you like, and sharing during this sort of period. And it comes back to the point everyone's made around intersectionality. You know, even within D&I, we tend to have our little silos and tend to operate within them. So in the UK, the protected characteristics, if you like, whereas actually there are so many touch points, and this was exactly what Christine was talking about as well. And it's sort of recognizing that and how we can share all of that. I think just coming back to the other point in terms of, you know, being afraid to ask the wrong question. A number of organizations now in the UK, and I'm sure, Sasha, you do this, running race fluency sort of courses. And I think that's an excellent sort of starting point, and almost doing it in a controlled environment, a safe environment helps. So the questions you wouldn't probably want to ask someone directly, but you can do in that sort of environment, I think is very helpful. And also just coming back to what Christine was talking about in terms of the role of managers here. So because you're not having those coffee machine, water cooler sort of conversations, I think managers have the biggest part to play here. And I think in certain organizations, HR needs to be disintermediated from that sort of connection, if you like, between staff. And managers need to get to know their staff at a personal level. So this comes back to my earlier point around not checking on them, but checking in, you know, how are they doing? What's their well-being? What support do they need? And not rely on the corporate communication vehicle, which is so generic, it doesn't pick up individuals' needs. So this is again what Christine was talking about in terms of the surveys. You know, they average everything out. You need to look at the demographics and the individuals within your team and really ask them what is it they require back from managers. And everyone's going to have a different response. So I think our sort of palette, if you like, here needs to be different. It can't be one colour in that sort of context.
Yeah, and I'm totally with you in terms of the decentralization. This is not an HR function. It's a function that should become organizational DNA, and we all have our own accountability for it, frankly. Onto the point of resources, we've had a really lovely comment here from Tanya. To the point that we need to educate ourselves, we have set up a reading list and a viewing list. Love the viewing, Netflix. A few documentaries have been suggested for our colleagues to cover a range of I&D aspects. We are now using that reading list for our firm's book club. I would be really keen to hear from you as to whether there are any books you'd recommend so that I can add to the reading list. And Tanya, I'm going to add my own thing, and also what should we be watching? So I'm going to go to Casey on that. Casey, have you got any good recommendations for how we can educate on what we should be watching on books, films, Netflix, podcasts?
In which area are you talking about? Inclusion
BLM,
or
particularly BLM?
Not really. And I want to just make also, I just want to take this opportunity to make the difference, because I've been asked many times, BLM is a movement and there's an organization. It's kind of two different things. You can be part of the movement, but not necessarily completely agree with the organization.
Okay.
It's kind of two different things.
Yeah.
It's a hashtag basically, or an actual full-blown organization. So I think when we talk about BLM, we have to be careful about not necessarily think that it's a political or community-driven organization. I follow the movement, but that doesn't mean I'm affiliated to the organization. Just that distinction.
Yeah.
So I don't really have any BLM, list. We're living the moment. So I think what I can actually advise is continue to look at, to watch different sources of information, maybe different types of media, read different blogs. I shared something very recently about the pyramid of Maslow and how it affects Black people. I thought that was a very good conversation, because I've been thinking about it. I say we always talk about self-actualization, but people who are actually at the bottom, self-actualization is something that they aspire to. So we talk about it as if we arrived, but some of us are actually not even at the second step. And for the others, we are struggling to get to the other rungans. So I think it's really important to really read, to ask questions. I think people who assume are probably in the most dangerous zone because they just assume. Whereas if you have the conversation, you can just have a perspective, a different answer.
And that's, I think, a really important life lesson, to challenge assumptions and to listen more, ask the questions. We've got a question here from Yvette. I'm going to hand this to Sanjeev. I don't know if you can read it. How do you engage managers who resist the new normal and persist on checking on their employees, and also are resistant to engage in the race conversation? Over to you.
Couple of ways. So the way I do it, for example, is because I have my direct reports and they have their direct reports. On a monthly basis, each of my teams, we get together and I do a sort of a debrief, if you like. So that's a good way in a virtual sense to get a temperature check in terms of what's going on. But what I've also do is I use something called personal expectation graphs. So I'll explain that very simply. So with each of my direct reports, I say to them, there's 3 things which I want you to do each month. And they similarly contract with me. They give me 3 things. And we score each other at the end of the month on those. And if we score each other more than 2 points apart, we discuss it. If it's within 2 points out of 10, we don't need to discuss it because we're in a band, if you like, we're within that. And one of my pegs is very much around inclusivity and making sure their team are involved. And what I then do is, again, with their agreement, and no one's ever said no to me, is on a sample basis, on a monthly, I will ring up and discuss with members of their team how I think they're doing. Yeah. So within that inclusivity and how are they being people managers as opposed to work managers, Are there examples? And I can use. Now I have to be very careful because, again, without divulging who it was, they have to trust that I've done that and I've gone through that sort of process. Now that's a very mechanistic way of doing it, but I think it works wonderfully because it's a two-way relationship. So they give me three things. They sort of say, look, this is what really pisses me off about how you manage me. So going forward, don't tell me how to do things, just tell me when it's got to be done by. So score me out of 10 on those. And that works really, really well. So that's one thing I've used. So they're called pegs. I use them as pegs.
Okay, and so very output driven.
Very output driven. It's always difficult. And I think if you were in the office, the way I would implement it would be different. Whereas now working remotely,
Yeah.
It's an environment. So you touched on this earlier, Sasha, when you talked about inclusive workplaces. Well, we don't have workplaces anymore, i.e. we're not in an office environment where culture, you can reflect in the decoration and the furniture, whether you're open style or whatever. Now we're in, spread across the world. So it's not a workplace, it's a work culture as opposed to workplace. And how do you make sure that sort of carries on in a different environment now? And that's a huge challenge for organizations, I think, because you could walk through the front door in an office and say, I know the culture of that organization. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't. So how do you bring that back in again in a cohesive sense?
Sure. Okay, thank you. And mindful of time, Christine, share with us your thoughts.
Just firstly on the reading list, I have put into the Q&A a reading list we put up right at the beginning of the COVID period when people had a bit more time. Please keep adding to it. And probably one thing that I think is really valuable to think about is there's so many different ways to think about how you can be an ally. And actually, one of the things I did early in the COVID period, our organisation is very much an advocacy organisation. We're very supportive, we're alongside, we don't name and shame, we're always trying to catch people getting things right and supporting people up in the journey. And actually, Quip Camp came out, just when we're talking about things you can see and read, on Netflix. It was very early on in COVID, maybe in April this year. And that's very much about people who were far more activist-based in their approach to disability rights. And it really reminded me how important that activism has been in generating change and specific and significant change. It led to the ADA in the USA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which has just turned 30 this year. Which has allowed Americans, and that has ended up being part of the Sustainable Development Goals in many countries have had their own activist movements, not just that one. That means now we have laws that are, as Sanjeev was talking about before, there are protected characteristics under the Equalities Act we're all responsible for. It's meant we have education that is all students, irrespective of different access needs, have a right to education and so on. Public buildings these days with all public websites and so on, as well as obviously this September. So this combination between there's an approach that suits you, there's an approach that suits others. There's no right way to get here, but being really cognizant of those different approaches and particularly the history that's got us here. Casey was talking about the history of women. Got us here. Let's learn from the past and let's learn what worked and let's keep that momentum going forward. Yes, so sorry, that was a bit on the reading list, but there is one.
No, that's really helpful, Christine. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm just going to sum up before I hand back to Dawn because we're near the hour. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for their input, for their ideas, their perspectives, and their rich knowledge. It's been fantastic. What do we take away from today? One, we're at a massive time of change, and avoiding that is at our cost. Two, this is about individualism. This is about treating people as they want to be treated, rather than assuming that people want to be treated like the way that we want potentially to be treated. That diversity in all of its many forms and intersectionality elements will and does and is suffering in the time against the pandemic, which leads us to the very strong conclusion that, frankly, inclusion has never, ever been more important, both in the workplace and in society at large. And with that, I'd like to thank Christine, thank Casey, thank Sanjeev, and hand back to Dawn.
Thank you so much, everybody, for that wonderful session. I have got a list as long as my arm here about takeaways I've personally had for today. And I guess if I had to choose one, it would be the check in and not check on statement. I absolutely love that. And I will be reflecting on that in terms of how I work with people virtually going forward. So I'm really keen to hear from people on the call about what your one takeaway might have been from today and what you might be doing differently going forward. If you feel you'd like to do that, please do feel free to post it in the Q&A. It really, really helps us to understand what events we could perhaps set up later on. We'd also love to hear your feedback. We have a wonderful technology-based feedback mechanism using a QR code, which, oh, there it is on the screen now. You just need to click on your camera on that QR code. You can then go into the feedback. Before we close, just a quick reminder, we have a load of events going on. It's Black History Month next month. So my wonderful co-chair, Yvette Forrester, will be talking to Ray Newton-Smith on the 8th of October. She's the chief economist of the CBI, around ethnicity reporting, which will be fabulous to listen to. And we have so many other events happening as well. But thank you so much, all the panelists, and thank you to you, our guests, for joining us. And I just leave you with the statement of have a great rest of the week. Happy inclusion to you all. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.